Hello everyone, and today we're going to go over the 5th chapter in Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, called The Emancipation of the Bourgeoisie. This starts the second section of the book called Imperialism. Arendt thinks that this imperialist behavior is a preparatory stage for Nazism. What's so important about this time is that it marks a period where the state's interface to foreign policy changes from that of maritime trade to expansion and subjugation. According to Arendt, it all starts with the bourgeoisie, whose lust for money makes them go seek assets in foreign countries. In order to secure their property in foreign countries, they require the state to protect those assets through violence. This using the state as a tool of violence in itself actually starts to destroy the nation-state that developed in the 19th century. Politics is no more just about keeping everything peaceful and safe within the nation, but it's used for expansion and power in foreign territory. But why did the state yield to the bourgeoisie looking for commerce outside the country at all? Why didn't they just keep to themselves? Well, in order to answer this question, we have to go to the end of the 19th century. Up to the 19th century, the bourgeoisie really didn't have any hand in politics. They didn't care about politics. All they really cared about were their own private capitalistic ventures. All the political decisions were left to the state. However, by the end of the 19th century, the bourgeoisie accumulated so much wealth that their money became superfluous. They couldn't find any use case for their money within the nation boundaries. But the bourgeoisie didn't want to just keep their money locked up in banks. Their attitude was they needed to get money, so they wanted to get more money. It's money begot money, and we'll hear this phrase later in the chapter. So what did they do? They took their money and ran to foreign countries to find other opportunities for economic expansion. The initial attempts at foreign investment by the bourgeoisie was handled by Jewish financiers, which makes sense because the Jews already did this for a commission and they already had an international body of Jewish family and Jewish relations that they could lean on. However, such an enterprise was a risk. While the Jews did have connections, they couldn't ensure the assets in foreign countries. They needed the state for that, the state which had an army and had a police force. Quote, "As soon as it became clear that export of money would have to be followed by an export of government power, the position of financiers in general, and Jewish financiers in particular, was considerably weakened. In the leadership of imperialist business transactions, an enterprise was gradually taken over by members of the native bourgeoisie." Now, no businessman exemplifies the bourgeoisie more than Cecil Rhodes. He was an Englishman who single-handedly replaced the Jewish financiers in South Africa. Now, Rhodes is one of the richest people in the world. You've probably heard of his name, the Rhodes Scholar. He had a country named after him called Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe. And he also became the Prime Minister of South Africa. The thing that drove Rhodes, it embodies the imperialistic mindset of the bourgeoisie. It's to money in order to get more money. Expansion for expansion's sake. That having money was not important, but getting more money was. Quote, "Expansion is everything. These stars, these vast worlds, which we can never reach. I would annex the planets if I could." But in order to make this dream manifest and get unlimited economic expansion, it also required a source of power that was also unlimited as well. At first, the nation-state dispatched police and army forces to foreign regions to control the area. At first, countries dispatched their police forces and army to the foreign areas. This led the basically protected resources for the nation. However, it also led to lawlessness. There was no ethics, no morality that would govern the rules of the economic system there. So basically, what was good was what makes money. Why did the states help these ambitious businessmen? Why did the government states care about these ambitious businessmen if all they should have cared about was the political body within their country? Well, it was important for England to secure these assets because the money was going outside their country. In order to get it reinvested back into the country, they needed to be a part of the plan. Without the national instruments of violence, putting the money out there would simply just be a gamble. With foreign investment protected by the export of government power, these assets became part of the economic system. This idea became basically the foreign policy for nations at this time. It was no longer as a means for trade, but it was a means for expansion. The essence of the political structure was power begot power, or power in order to get more power. But power didn't mean setting up structures. Power only meant the efficacy of getting more wealth and controlling that wealth. In such an environment, rules were broken and corruption was unleashed. Quote, "Worse than corruption was the fact that the incorruptible were convinced that imperialism was the only way to conduct world politics." This expansion led to an entirely new conflict that hadn't been seen before. The government, in order to maintain the resources abroad, needed to instantiate new forms of political power there. They called them the colonial administrators. Now, these are separate from the businessmen. The businessmen worked with the colonial administrators in order to protect the assets. The colonial administration needed the state in order to get protection for the resources, and the state needed the colonial administrators in order to make sure that the resources would get back to the country. According to Arendt, the colonial administrators resented the state government from which they came. All they cared about was getting as much money as possible, which meant setting up no rules. Basically, do whatever is needed in order to get money. However, the nation wanted to instantiate laws in order to create some kind of stability. The attempting of representing the country by the colonial administrators is called the imperial factor. But the imperials were right about one thing. The nation-state as it stood could not be a form of an empire. It couldn't expand indefinitely. And that was because of the nature of how the nation-state gained its power. Why is the nation-state limited? Well, the nation-state's built on the idea that its citizens will confer the status of authority onto the government. This basically means that the citizens need to obey and feel like it's part of the country. However, this is anything but the case when you're going to foreign nations. The people there or the tribes there will not just bow to you. Quote, "Conquest by a nation led either to the full awakening of the conquered people's national consciousness or to consequent rebellion against the conqueror, or to tyranny. Although tyranny doesn't require consent, it also leads to the destruction of all the national institutes of the people. Tyranny did allow for the unlimited accumulation of power, which would support the unlimited accumulation of wealth. However, it would require a way of destroying all political structures that get in the way and laws of wealth accumulation. What became the most important was no longer a nationalism, but only the full accumulation of wealth that was possible. Quote, "Wake up to the fact that you cannot live unless you have the trade of the world, that your trade is the world, and your life is the world, and not England." Now, this power-hungry attitude marks the beginnings of totalitarianism, according to Arendt. Quote, "For every political structure, new or old, left to itself develops stabilizing forces, which stand in the way of constant transformation and expansion. Therefore, all political bodies appear to be temporary obstacles when they are seen as part of an internal stream of growing power." The idea of power as the essence of politics was fully in the entertainment of the bourgeoisie. This is exactly what they wanted in their secret convictions. So long excluded from the state, they were now emancipated into the political realm. For the bourgeoisie, the state was really only a tool in order to protect their property. So what does it mean to be a bourgeoisie? Arendt then analyzes this new idea of power in order to get more power, basically the idea of imperialism and the idea of the bourgeoisie. She does this by referring back to Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher from the 17th century. Hobbes is important not because he is able to predict why everything happened at the end of the 19th century, but because he created a political system that comes with the presupposition of man as being a power-thirsty animal. In other words, Hobbes predicts the bourgeois man. Quote, "Man is essentially a function of society and judged therefore according to his value or worth, his price. That is to say so much as would be given for the use of his power, and this price is constantly evaluated by society of the esteem of others. According to Hobbes, the power of an individual is conditioned on his ability to regulate prices and supply and demand. And desire for that power is the passion of man. For Hobbes, all men are equal not because they share some existential being in the world, but because they all have the equal privilege of being able to kill one another. In nature, man is against man, and they are antagonistic towards each other. Man forms groups in order to get more power, in order to be able to have more violence. However, groups form, larger groups form, and it's not until we have a monopoly, which he calls the sovereign, that everybody must abide to. Quote, "The Commonwealth is based on the delegation of power and not of rights. It acquires a monopoly on killing and provides in exchange a conditional guarantee against being killed." In this society, there's no question of what's right and what's wrong. It's only really a matter of obedience. What's interesting about this society as well is that if the sovereign does not take care of man, then man will use violence against the sovereign in order to get what he wants. Quote, "Hobbes foresees and justifies the social outcasts' organization into a gang of murderers as a logical outcome of the bourgeoisie's moral philosophy." In this way, Arendt predicts that by using Thomas Hobbes, we can explain the occurrence of the mob. What Hobbes achieves also is a picture of how man ought to behave in order to be successful in this sort of society. He gives proof that in order to get the unlimited process of capital accumulation, one also needs a political structure that is unlimited in power so that it can protect it properly. But there's a question about this. One can only get enough power and claim so many resources until one has everything. So the question becomes, how do we quench our thirst for power when we've already conquered everything? According to Arendt, this can be done through destruction. Quote, "Property by itself is subject to use and consumption and therefore diminishes constantly. The most radical and only secure form of possession is destruction, for only what we have destroyed is safely and forever ours." Quote, "If the last victorious commonwealth cannot proceed to annex the planets, it can only proceed to destroy itself in order to begin anew the never-ending process of power generation." Even more so, the expansion into these foreign lands led to a whole new sense and reinvigoration of nationalistic pride. When the Europeans landed in Africa, they saw the African tribes as lower people. Quote, "I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. I contend that every acre added to our territory means the birth of more of the English race who otherwise would not be brought into existence." It's almost as if the Englishmen wanted to make Africans better Africans. I don't know if I've heard anything more racist than that. According to Arendt, the mob became racial, and this created an alliance between the poor and the rich. Quote, "The fact that this mob could be used only by imperialist politicians and inspired only by racial doctrines made it appear as though imperialism alone were able to settle the grave domestic, social, and economic problems of modern times." According to Arendt, although Thomas Hobbes doesn't come up with any racial doctrine, it can be concluded through his ideas that nations become races. And it's this idea of race or blood that started to invigorate the mob in the 20th century Europe that led finally to totalitarianism and Nazism. Thanks, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the summary of Chapter 5 of Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, coming to you soon with Chapter 6. Bye.